Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game. And today I'm going to take a look at my 5 most underrated legendary cards. To me, these are the legendary cards that are actually quite strong and have a lot of raw power, but haven't quite taken off in the metagame. They maybe just need a little more experimentation, the right deck to take full advantage of them, or slight shift in the meta here and there to really reveal just how powerful they are. But I think somewhere down the road, these cards might just have an impact, so don't give up on these 5 underrated legendary cards. Starting with my 5th most underrated legendary, actually right here on the first page, it's Tink Master over Spark. This 3-mana 3/3 doesn't sound too exciting in regards to raw stats, but I actually think Tink Master's Battle Cry is underrated. It transforms a random minion into a 5/5 Devilsaur or a 1/1 Squirrel. So a lot of the times the Tink Master has seen play in the past, it's kind of as a removal spell for really big scary minions like Ragnaros. Like if the Ragnaros is the only other thing on the board, you're guaranteeing to make Ragnaros a lot weaker. But I actually don't think that's the only utility that Tink Master Overspark has. He's still certainly good in those scenarios. I actually think Tink Master Overspark needs a little bit more experimentation in aggressive decks in particular. For instance, like a zoo deck, particularly a zoo deck that's all about token minions like 1/1s, getting them out onto the board really rapidly. If you played Tink Master Overspark with a board full of token minions, the worst case scenario is that it turns one of your other tokens into a 1/1, which was already a 1/1, so you're not really hurting yourself. But you could also be getting a 5/5 Devilsaur virtually for free, which could be a huge swing and absolutely just win you games outright all on its own. Now the downside, of course, is that you can turn an enemy minion into a 5/5 as well, but if you're an aggressive deck, typically the other deck is already going to be playing bigger, scarier minions, and they might have very powerful effects that you're trying to negate, like Taunt or like an Emperor Thaurissan, for instance, that you can't remove outright. Even in those situations, turning it into a 5/5 Devilsaur, which is a neutral, seemingly powerless minion compared to what it could have been, isn't really all that bad. So occasionally, yes, you might turn like a Knife Juggler into a 5/5, so it gets a big buff increase, but negating the effect, it's something you can probably ignore or remove anyway if you're an aggressive deck. To me, I think Tink Master Overspark has a chance as both a late game control removal spell, but also an aggressive zoo-style board presence card. He's underrated. Moving on to my number 4 spot, but he's not a 4-mana card. He's a 5-mana card. That is Blingtron 3000. Now, I will make a note that this is probably the least underrated of my top 5 underrated cards, in that Blingtron 3000 has been experimented with a fair bit, and people try him out. And it typically doesn't work, but I do think there will come a day, and there might even be a deck right now, that Blingtron 3000 still fits in and makes sense. The reason I like Blingtron 3000 so much, he's a 5-mana 3/4. That's not good on its own, right? 3/4 for 5 is not a good stat allocation for its cost, but he has some really strong benefits. His battle cry: equip a random weapon for each player. So you get a weapon, the opponent gets a weapon. They're totally random. You might get a good one, you might get a bad one, you might give your opponent a Doomhammer, and you might get a Light's Justice, right? You could totally lose out on this trade, but in aggressive decks that are looking to burn down opponents or develop resources via tempo as quickly as possible, Blingtron 3000 gives you those advantages. He gives you your weapon first. He gives it to you potentially on a huge tempo advantage. You could get like a 7-mana Gorehowl for only 5 mana total, along with a 3/4 body. That would just be a huge tempo swing and a big advantage in your favor, which would also be 7 instant damage, so it's like a free fireball if you're looking to kill your opponent. Plus, you have the benefit of initiative with Blingtron 3000. So yes, they might get a weapon, but you get your weapon first, and you get to use it first, because weapons have charge, essentially, which means you could kill their minion first and impact the board more directly and more immediately. And direct and immediate initiative plays like that tend to be very strong in Hearthstone, whereas waiting a turn and being reactive is a little bit harder to win. So Blingtron Gives you potentially a lot of value. He gives you initiative. He actually even functions sometimes to remove your opponent's weapon. If the enemy paladin has an Ashbringer from Tyrion, you might be able to turn it into something much, much worse, right? So there are multiple advantages of the Blingtron. Of course, there are some downsides, but in a deck that focuses on winning first and losing second, in other words, an aggressive deck that's all about pumping out resources and looking for wins, I think Blingtron 3000 could find a home and fit in, particularly if there are just a couple more mech cards added, which it does seem like Blizzard is still interested in the mech tribal because they sent out a new one with League of Explorers, so there may still be new mechs on the way, which could make Blingtron even better in certain classes. I think this is a card that isn't ready to go away just yet. Don't disenchant your Blingtron. There may be a day that this underrated card comes back to the forefront. Moving on, my third most underrated card. We're going to go to the Rogue class. I don't actually have this one, so bear with me as we look at this invisible version of Trade Prince Gallywix. This 6 mana 5/8 has never really seen play in a popular rogue deck. As you'll note, I don't have one because I've never needed to make one. Obviously, I could afford it, but Trade Prince, you aren't exactly very popular these days. That said, I think that's a shame because this is actually an incredible card. 5/8 for 6 is a fantastic stat allocation, right? It's a pure value stat allocation, much like Boulder Fist Ogre. It has the same number of stats, so it's right in line as far as its cost is concerned. But actually 5/8 is even better than 6/7 because most big threats in this game have 5 or less health, which means you can kill all the important stuff like Emperor Thorisons or Lothebs or Sylvanas or whatever it may be with this attack. But you have even more health to work with, which makes this minion even harder to remove. And that's the thing about Trade Prince Gallywix in the first place, is that he's so difficult to deal with. Sending minions in to kill him and making inefficient trades doesn't feel very good because his stats are so good for that. He can maybe eat 3 or 4 minions just because he has so much health. Not only that, if you try to use a spell to remove him, you're basically giving your opponent a spell for free, which means you're giving me a spell for free if I'm playing Trade Prince Gallywix. So he's got a great body, he trades efficiently, he's efficient at 6 mana, so he's not too expensive, or he's not going to slow you down necessarily. He functions as card draw in a sense, because if your opponent wants to use a spell when he's around, you're getting that spell for free. You do have a slight downside in that you give them the coin, or a coin to use, so you're kind of floating them a mana if they use a spell. But typically that doesn't punish you very hard, particularly after turn 6, when the coin becomes less and less valuable every turn because they have less resources, and they can't jump ahead in mana as easily. So the downside here is minimal. The upside is huge, particularly with Rogue, a class that can benefit from spells in a lot of different ways. So, Trade Prince Gallywix, I think there's a day he's going to be very good and be central to kind of a late game control board-oriented rogue deck because he has so many different advantages. There are other minions yet to come that will take advantage of your opponent playing spells. So I do have a bit of a theme there, in that I think cards that counter spells from your opponents are going to get better and better as Hearthstone ages. So if you've been sitting on a Trade Prince Gallywix for a little while and you're really itching to hit that disenchant button, it might be worth it, but maybe you should consider giving this card another shot. I think he's underrated. Moving on to the second most underrated legendary on my list, I'm going to look at a pirate by the name of Captain Greenskinned. This 5 mana, 5/4 has really only ever seen play in bad pirate decks and the occasional weapon deck, like a weapon warrior that's very aggressive. But I don't think that's the only place that Captain Greenskinned belongs. I actually think this is a pretty powerful card that's not just a tech card, but might just be a nice value card to slot into a variety of different decks. And as more and more weapons hit the game, I have a feeling they're going to get better and better with even better effects. And when you have weapons that are good, with effects that are strong, Captain Greenskin is just going to keep getting better, but I already think he's quite good. 5/4 for 5 mana is not admittedly the best stat line. It is slightly vulnerable to cards like Paladin Shredder, but on the other hand, it does still trade efficiently into all the scary 5 health stuff like your Sylvanas and your Lothebs and your Emperor Thorisons. So his body's not too bad, but this battle cry is surprisingly strong. I don't think people realize just how good this battle cry can be. For 5 mana, you're basically sometimes doubling the effectiveness of your weapon. For instance, let's go back to Gorehowl. We've used him as an example as the past. Give your weapon +1/+1 on Gorehowl. Basically gives you another Gorehowl. It might go up to 8/2, which means you can hit the enemy face and still have a Gorehowl, right? That's insane. Even on something like a Doomhammer. +1 durability on Doomhammer doesn't seem that good, because it's like it already had 8. That's not a very big difference. But 3 attack on a Doomhammer means you're hitting for 6 every turn instead of 4, which could make Shamans even scarier. Even something as simple as like a Death Spite. This gives you more control over the Death Rattle effect. It makes it hit for 5, which is very important when you're trying to kill all those pesky Sludge Belchers. The flexibility, the value, the body, all that stuff mixed together, in my mind, means Captain Greenskin really needs a closer look. I think this card is good. Can you imagine like a 5/3 True Silver Champion in Paladin? You get to heal for 6. You get to hit for 5 damage 3 times. That kind of stuff is crazy. As a turn 4 into a turn 5, that could be an insane power play. True Silver into Captain Greenskin. And there are other opportunities like that exist with this card. It's just that people don't really like to fit him in, probably just because his body is a little weak. But I want to see Captain Greenskin played even more. And then finally, I have one last card that I think is the most underrated legendary in all of Hearthstone right now. This is going to sound a little weird, because in many cases, this card was actually overrated for a very long time. At the release of Goblins vs. Gnomes, when Trogdor the Earthinator was revealed, everyone and their brother thought that this was the ultimate GVG card. It's going to change the game. It was so overpowered. It needed a nerf before it ever even hit the board. Everyone was convinced Trogdor was going to dominate the game. And of course, they ignored a guy like Dr. Boom. No one thought Dr. Boom sounded all that powerful. He was too susceptible to Big Game Hunter, etc., etc. In reality, we had it crazy wrong. Dr. Boom is the best card in the game. And Trogdor never, ever, 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 ever gets played, which I think is actually a shame. This card has gone from probably the most overrated Hearthstone card of all time to what I would argue is now the most underrated legendary card in the game. So why do I think Trogdor is so good? Much like I mentioned earlier with Trade Prince Gallywix, I think cards that counter spells are underrated in general and still have a lot of value. The way Hearthstone works these days, it's all about initiative, getting that minion out first, and then using spells to keep and leverage that board advantage that you've gained from early game minions. That's all what decks like Zoo are about. That's even what Secret Paladin is about to an extent. All these control decks do exactly that. They want minions first, and then they'll deal with the board later. In that kind of metagame, in that world, Trogdor the Earthinator is actually very good. Worst case scenario, Trogdor the Earthinator is a 7 mana 6/6 with Taunt, which isn't particularly exciting, but it's still enough to scare your opponents. Best case scenario, Trogdor the Earthinator is infinite value because they have to use 3 or 4 spells to remove him. He can absolutely shut down decks like Tempo Mage, for instance, that are very reliant on early game spells, or perhaps Priest, who likes to use a lot of spells as well and use them in rapid succession. Cards like Trogdor shut those down. Worst case scenario with Trogdor, like against a Priest, they use Shadow Word Death to kill it. They've used a 3 mana removal spell. You have gained a 3/5 minion after Trogdor has died, so you don't even really have a tempo loss here. You're even on tempo, you've still got a body, you've wasted removal. It does some pretty cool stuff. If this card were just played with a little more and played with a little differently if people tried a little harder, perhaps to keep it on board, protecting it behind taunts and something like a handlock style deck, I'd still like to see this thing in action and influencing the game. I guess I still subscribe to the fact that Trogdor could be ridiculously overpowered if only we gave him another chance, or perhaps maybe the metagame just moved here or there, left or right, just a shade. Trogdor will have his time in the sun. So yes, he's worse than Dr. Boom right now, but I do think there's a chance he could be amazing. I have not given up on Trogdor the Earthinator. He's my most underrated card in Hearthstone. I still want to play him. I sneak him into control decks now and then. He still does work for me, and I love this card. So there you have it. That for me is the 5 most underrated cards in the game. You probably think I'm crazy. You probably think these cards are terrible, and you're probably going to tell me why. And that's just fine. I'd love to hear your comments and your thoughts and your discussion. Perhaps you have some cards you think are drastically underrated. Share your list with me in the comments. I would love to hear it. Happy to discuss it with you. If you enjoyed this video, please do subscribe. Got lots more top 5 and top 10 videos discussing the game in ways like this, so we always appreciate that subscription. Thanks so much for watching. Good luck out there on the ranked ladder. Try out these cards, and until next time, game on.